Georges Dumézil and the New Comparative Mythology, a response from Jungian structural psychoanalysis, a workshop by Robert Moore, presented by the C. G. Jung Institute of Chicago on January 24th and 25th, 1998.
Welcome to this workshop on the work of Dumézil and in relationship to Jungian studies of the collective unconscious, which I, as many of you know, call structural psychoanalysis. And first of all, let me just say how much I appreciate your coming today, because I wondered if this thing would make so that we could do it. Because this is, shall we say, rather advanced work in Jungian theory formulation and attempting to carry Jung's work forward. And so I'm deeply indebted to each of you for taking your time this weekend to come out and think with me about these matters. The stuff we'll be covering is complicated, but as I said to Bob Geppert a while ago, it's an extremely rich thicket. But I hope that we can take a machete and carve our path through some of this stuff so that you can see why I believe that it's important to have Jungians who are trying to develop Jungian thought look at the particular materials that we'll be looking at together and think about the relevance of many, many studies that have already been done for Jungians who really take the collective unconscious seriously. So I'm really indebted to you, and I really appreciate your taking the time to think with me on this today and tomorrow. And I do want to emphasize that I want to call upon you to, after you kind of get oriented, to help me think about the wider implications of this material and some of the questions that need to be, I want you to help me think about the questions that need to be asked after you get oriented to this. And I want you to be brainstorming overnight especially, and thinking about if Dumézil's work has any merit, then what implications does this have for the development of a scientific Jungian psychoanalysis? And then what implications does that have for personal psychology and the struggle for integration of the self? What implications does it have for social psychology, political psychology, and so on? I personally think the implications are enormous, and I'm very excited about this. Actually, because you've signed up to do this, I get to do what I really, would love to spend a lot more time doing. That is to really think on the cutting edge of my thought. A lot of people don't realize it, but professors and analysts in the daily course of their work don't really have very much time to focus on the cutting edge of their thought. And so you're giving me that chance to work with you around that this weekend, and I really appreciate it. Let me just say in introduction, welcome from the faculty of the Jung Institute and the community of Jungian analysts here in Chicago. And I want to speak a word of indebtedness to the larger community of Jungian thinkers. This workshop would not be happening if it were not for John Beebe, the editor of the San Francisco Institute Library Journal, and my friend Al Collins, who is a Jungian-oriented psychologist. I believe Al's still in Alaska. In an issue of the San Francisco Institute Library Journal not so very long ago, they called attention to the parallels between my work and Dumézil's work. And I have since had a chance to at least begin studies of that body of work and to begin to think about the implications of that for Jungian thought. So I'm indebted to the San Francisco Jung Institute Library Journal for making it possible for me to be aware of this enormous body of research. So Let me just say a few words about my interest and passion in this topic, and then I'm going to let me just say what I hope for us to do today and tomorrow. This morning, I want to context the kinds of issues that have to be on the table if we are to get a sense for what our task is in reflecting on these things. And that is to talk about, in the first part, the central importance of the concept of the collective unconscious if one is to really carry forward Jung's project. Now that should be obvious, but these days it is not. Because there are a lot of folks that are radically de-emphasizing the objective psyche and the collective unconscious. And I want to underscore how I think that's extremely damaging to Jungian psychology and why it's important for us to really take serious research into what is the collective unconscious, the objective psyche. And then before lunch, I want to review some previous approaches to myth and psyche that have been influenced by a Jungian point of view, to give you a better context. We want to appreciate the work of Jung, Campbell, Eliade, and Jean Bolin. We want to appreciate them. It's very important in any attempt to interpret theories that you first appreciate their contribution. But before lunch, I want to say what some of the limitations in each of these approaches. And that will prepare us for looking at an introductory, what I'd like to call an intellectual reconnaissance of Dumézil's work. Because I can say to you today that this is not a finished product. We're only beginning looking at this from a Jungian point of view. And I want to invite you and those listening on the audio tapes of this workshop to begin working together in this rich field of inquiry. So anyway, after lunch we will look at an introduction to Dumézil's work, the so-called New Comparative Mythology. We'll look at those handouts, and I will suggest to you some ways in which this body of literature in some ways offers substantial movement forward in studies of the structure of mythology. And then, as you will see this morning, if you're Jungian, if you start understanding the structure of mythology, then you feel that that is about the structure of the psyche. So before the end of the day, we will look at some of the key assumptions of Dumézil, and then we will look at some of the issues we want to raise, that I want to raise from the point of view of my own structural psychoanalysis. So we'll do that tomorrow, and then we'll move into the issue of the war of the functions, a primary concept of Dumézil and his followers. The war of the functions, the war of the foundations. Now those of you that know my work may think that came out of my work. Well, I came to an idea of the war of the functions before I knew anything about Dumézil's work. And it is absolutely astounding to me to find another scholar who has a primary concept grounded in the war of the functions. So in terms of our work together and what you may benefit from this for this weekend personally, not just intellectually, I would have a goal of your thinking deeply about the war of the functions that we'll be talking about, and how the war of the functions may be acting itself out on the stage of your life. And Dumézil believes that the war of the functions acts itself out throughout whole cultures, whole eras. And what I want to do with you is to bridge his understanding of the war of the functions to my understanding of the war of the functions, and then think together about what this idea of the war of the functions means to us personally, socially, politically, ethically, and so on. So if you get a deeper understanding of the War of the Functions in Dumézil and in my work and how they interact, we will have had a worthwhile time together. Okay? So I just want to say that this is, if I had all the money I needed to pay my mortgage, and if I did not have such deep concern about a lot of things in our society, so that I did not have to work with the men's movement, or I did not have to work in education of spiritual leaders and so on, and I did not have to worry about some of these larger agendas of our planet, I'd spend a lot more time working on this stuff. So you can get a little feel for how much I cherish this time with you. Let's get started here. First thing that I'd just like to reflect on is framing this issue of the distinctiveness of a Jungian approach to psychoanalysis. And I've called these reflections Jungian psychology as a structural psychoanalysis. I would have hoped that I would not have had to push that issue so much, push the concept of Jungian thought as a structural psychoanalysis. But since Jung's work, there have been a lot of developments in Jungian circles, which, in my view, really compromise the possibilities of building on Jung's original work. And some of you have heard me talk about the different views of the unconscious. I mean, on a lot of my lectures, I have laid out a variety of approaches to the unconscious in great detail. And I won't belabor that today, except to say that without understanding that all approaches to psychoanalysis are not the same, and theory matters. And if we're going to get at the issues that we need to work together on this weekend, we need to look at this issue of the importance of keeping an understanding of the collective unconscious and the objective psyche at the center of Jungian studies. Now, why is that? Well, as I've lectured to some of you before ad nauseum on this topic, most psychologies have no understanding whatsoever of a collective unconscious. Many of them have no conception of an unconscious at all. Then when you get into the field of psychoanalysis, beginning with Freud, moving through Adlerian work, other variants of the Freudian tradition, there is an understanding of the unconscious or unconscious behavior, but it is an extremely shallow and personal unconscious focused endeavor. That is to say, in spite of the fact that Freud, in the early days, Freud had a deep interest in the collective unconscious, not discussed today among Freudians. A lot of his passion was in looking at the images and the structures in the imagination that were not personal, but which he believed were in some way inherited. That was in the early classical days of Freud's work. As the Freudian tradition has developed, Freudian work has turned more and more away from being a psychology of the id, or the instinctual level of the psyche, the so-called primitive level of psyche, to a psychology of the ego. Now, I think to study Freud without really looking at his studies of the id, what is the id like? The it. That is not the ego, and that is not the personal unconscious, just the personal unconscious. What are these instinctual powers in the psyche that drive the human psyche? The most interesting things about Freud's work are his psychology of the id, not his psychology of the ego. And as they have moved away from the study of the id in Freudian circles, they have turned away from the very topics which are the most, in many ways, the most interesting topics scientifically. about those raw things in our unconscious that are there waiting for us to discover them, or are waiting to possess us. So in any case, Freud himself, we need to be clear, was very interested in these primordial energies and representations and images and themes in the psyche. If you read his work on Moses and monotheism, and realize how passionate he was about mythology and so forth as a source for psychoanalysis, you'll get a sense for that. But as I say, in recent years, and the kinds of Freudian thought that's influencing contemporary Jungians, and I think influencing them too much, are basically ego psychologies. And while you and I have to be concerned about how well our egos function, because that's relevant for the war of the functions, while we have to be concerned about how well our egos work, if you know the task of the ego is integration, but you don't know what it is that's having to be integrated, you're not being too effective. See? So the key issue here theoretically is that in the vast sweep of Freudian studies, they have moved away from Freud's early interest in the deeper and more impersonal dimensions of the unconscious, which we have to struggle with as humans. And that would not be so relevant today for us trying to do Jungian psychoanalysis, trying to carry Jung's tradition forward. That would not be so relevant if it weren't for the fact that so many contemporary analysts who still call themselves Jungian have been turning away a lot from Jung's work to what I, given that last workshop I did, what I consider to be idealizations of contemporary Freudian traditions. Idealizations of, and I value self-psychology out of Kohut's tradition, but an idealization of that tradition, an idealization of what we know today as object relations theory, an idealization particularly of Kleinian traditions out of England, and moving away from the roots of interest in the collective unconscious that Jung felt to be so important to his work. And so it's really a kind of a contemporary avoiding of the fundamental issues of research in the collective unconscious that is leading a lot of people to try to turn Jungian psychology either into an ego psychology, or if those who are following Hillman's tradition, doing away pretty much with the concept of structure in general. That is, if you follow James Hillman, and James Hillman, let me just say, James Hillman is a very brilliant man, very erudite, widely read, extremely knowledgeable. But when it comes to locating his work in psychoanalytic theory, in my view, he's really an Adlerian, not a Jungian. Because Alfred Adler did not believe in the collective unconscious either. He believed that there were fictions in the psyche that were very real and influential and that you had to take seriously. But he didn't have them grounded in an archetypal self. And he did not have them grounded in any kind of deep structures. That's the key issue for us. You see, in my view, if you're really going to do Jungian work, in my view, by definition, you are looking for deep structures. And so that's why I have felt that I must start saying Jungian structural psychoanalysis. Because today, if you say Jungian, increasingly it doesn't mean anything theoretically. Were they really? Are they kind of concerned about this?
Yes, my brother-in-law. He does very much of object relations and Kohut.
Right. Right. And let me just reiterate that I'm not saying that we should not study Kohut or recent Freudians or object relations theory. But the key issue for us is to get a sense about what this is all about. I mean, theory matters. And data does not interpret itself. You need to have, it's one thing to have the Hubble telescope and be scanning all of these specks of light. But if you do not have theories which try to help you interpret that data, you've got some interesting points of light and some interesting behavior of infrared and so on. But it does not really interpret itself. And what I'm concerned about is that people who think it's not important to keep a center in a search for deep structures and their implications for the personality and social functioning, if you do not keep that clear, then suddenly you think, for example, what makes you a Jungian is interpreting dreams. But interpreting dreams doesn't make you Jungian at all. A lot of people interpret dreams. Or studying myths. Studying myths doesn't make you Jungian. A lot of people study myths. Being interested in spiritual issues, that doesn't make you Jungian. Because a lot of people that are not Jungian and do not share Jungian concepts do that. The idea of dreams having parts of the psyche in them and integrating them, that doesn't make you Jungian. Gestaltists do that. So all I'm suggesting to you is, if you're really going to get a handle on what I think is important in terms of carrying, if we're going to have a Jungian psychoanalysis and try to carry this tradition forward scientifically, as a scientific psychoanalysis and not just another form of literary criticism or sort of a cult like Noel accuses Jungian psychology of being, there are Jungian cultists who turned the collected works into the Black Bible and who turned it into a religion. And people are free to do what they want to do, and I protect people's rights to do that in my work on religious persecution. But that's not what I think is carrying Jungian psychoanalysis forward. Do you get a sense for what I'm trying to say here? Yes, Bill.
Well, if I could just make an observation. Historically, Freud was doing most of his work, or a lot of his early work, in the late 1800s. Jung a little bit behind him as a younger man.
Right.
And both, as you said, were very concerned with primordial images and aspects of instinct. You have to remember that Darwin only published Origin of Species in 1859, and The Descent of Man was not published until about, I think, 1880. 20 years later, he finally got the courage. An earlier approach to evolution and instincts had been published by a Frenchman, Lamarck. And Lamarckian evolutionary theory was generally accepted view that both Freud and Jung embraced. And in particular, and this is why I think Freudians tend to avoid this now, because it's very embarrassing, because Lamarckian Lamarckian theories have been completely disproved.
Right. And Freud's appropriation of that, is embarrassing.
Freud took that on, particularly in terms of, Lamarck felt that if I believed something or acquired a characteristic, I would pass that on to my children. I.e., Freud then used that in terms of the killing of Moses, his theory of the Jewish people killing Moses, that guilt was then acquired and passed on down.
You read Totem and Taboo, and Totem and Taboo picks up on that. That's right. And
so that's why people have then begun to back off from that, because it was based on a scientific theory that has been since proven false.
Yeah. Now that's an interesting. See, if everybody in science did that, in terms of forgetting the important questions when you were wrong about your conclusions, we wouldn't have the science we have today. See, but now that is what happened.
And Jung didn't quite, although Jung was somewhat of a Lamarckian, he wasn't quite so wedded to that.
Right.
Now, to me, in terms of, I think you're right, in terms of an acid test, Jungian or not, it's the archetypes and deep structures.
Deep structures.
To me, the most compelling evidence for the Jungian approach that I've ever seen is the work of John Bowlby. If you read his 3-volume work, Attachment, Separation, and Loss, John Bowlby is an English psychiatrist. And what I would call archetypes, what he calls behavioral systems,
yes,
that he describes in human children and coming out of primates. To me, the book screams Jung throughout.
Yes.
And so I believe that you're absolutely correct in that it's the deep structural archetypes. And two, I believe that there's emerging very much scientific evidence that will continue to support this, and that Jung will recover some lost ground in the next 10 years.
Bill is, for the tape, Bill is lifting up the work of John Bowlby and his work on behavioral systems. as really relevant for the quest to map deep structures that we're talking about. It's absolutely true, and I want to recommend that people that have not already done so look at Anthony Stevens's work. Anthony Stevens has been very interested in that particular tradition, and if you look at Stevens' work, all of Stevens' work is relevant for this work. In fact, in some ways, the project of Anthony Stevens is closest to my project in terms of his attempt to bridge scientific research and classical Jungian theory, and really try to update, have a neo-Jungian theory instead of a post-Jungian theory. So-called post-Jungians throw out the concept of the deep structures. But in any case, thank you for that, Bill, and that is very true. And so Stevens' book, Archetypes and Natural History of the Self, his little introduction called On Jung, his book, The Roots of War. The second one is On Jung. Then his book, The Roots of War, and especially this book, The 2 Million Year Old Self, which has not gotten wide circulation, but it came out of a series of lectures he did down at A&M at the Jungian Studies program down there. But in any case, that supports what Bill has said. I mean, he has done enormous scanning for the scientific studies of different disciplines which support the whole idea of these deep structures, and he's just got his telescope looking in a different direction than we do today. I mean, I think that it's important to carry Jungian psychoanalysis forward to pursue the kind of things that Stevens is pursuing and supplement it with the kind of thing we're doing today. So in any case, theory matters. If you do not raise the question, what kind of animal are we? What kind of species are we? And, it's very hard for human beings we're so grandiose. I mean, it is extremely hard for human beings to think that they have inherited a psyche. Not through Lamarckian kinds of processes, but through evolutionary, what we call today evolutionary psychology. It's very hard for us because we want to think we're not animals. And in my personal view, the reason we're despoiling the environment so fast is because deep down in our grandiosity, we really do not believe we're animals. We think we're above all that. And therefore, we don't need a habitat. We don't need a habitat for humanity because we're not animals. Now, I think this incredible grandiosity is leading us toward the abyss. And so what is the antidote to that? Well, we have to face the fact that we are a species. Now, theologically and spiritually speaking, there are a lot of open windows on that. I mean, you can think beyond your neurobiology, or you can think about the theological and spiritual significance of your neurobiology, and you can think about the ongoing evolution that I hope we're going to be participating in now. I hope that we are. I have a friend in NASA who is one of the chief, Kenneth Cox, who is one of the chief theoreticians about the cultural impact of space exploration, the spiritual and cultural implications. And he believes that actually space exploration is really a part of this human evolutionary process, about trying to get a perspective on ourselves. And I agree with him about that. But we're having a hard time getting beyond this grandiosity. And one of the key reasons is we do not want to do what we do to other species. We don't want to, we're perfectly willing to study the characteristic behavior patterns of birds, characteristic behavior patterns of other species. But when it comes to, we're sort of like Christians in the 19th century, It's all right for us to study all those primitives, quote unquote, but we don't want to apply these same methods to studying Christianity. And we are sort of like that today. We don't want to really examine the inherited 2 million year old patterns in the psyche, which are these deep structures that Jung was interested in and that Stevens has talked about, and I'm trying to lead us in working on some today. So in any case, that is very key, because if you do not keep that at the center of Jungian thought, then Jungian psychology is reduced, like so many others, to ego psychology and to personal unconscious and to your personal history. And then you believe that the problems that we're having and that you're having are simply because of traumas in your family, or simply because of something that happened to you. Perhaps you would not have the problems of the War of the Functions if your mother had not been the way she was, or the father hadn't been the way he was. You wouldn't have a problem with aggression, or you wouldn't have a problem with sexuality, or you wouldn't have a problem of meaning and so forth if you had not had these traumas that occurred. And that's what ego psychologists do. You begin to reduce everything to personal history and personal unconscious. Well, now let me be very clear here. I know all that's important. Before I was a Jungian analyst, I was an Adlerian analyst. I know that early experiences are important. And my first book was a Freudian book. I know that personal identity formation stuff is important. But if we're going to understand the incredible challenge of integration, this issue of integrating the self, it's very important to know what the pieces of the puzzle are if you're going to put a puzzle together. So anyway, that's my wrap on that, and you may feel that I'm overemphasizing it, but I don't think I am, because I think this is it. The question of whether 50 years from now there will be a Jungian psychoanalysis or not in the year 2040, whatever, turns on this. Because there is, if everything gets collapsed into ego psychology, we don't add anything to what other people are doing. So anyway, so that is the larger context. Now let me just open it for some concepts, for some issues, questions, discussions, and then we'll take a very brief break, and I'll come back and I will show how the Jungian tradition has struggled to take advantage of studies of mythology before. Then we'll be set up for really bringing in the Dumézilian perspective, and we'll draw on our folks that have studied this before to help us flesh some of that out. But anyway, let me just open it up now. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Do you get it? It's very important, because if you don't get that issue of the importance of mapping the inner cosmos that exists before your personal ego, then it's hard to understand why studying Dumézil is important. So any comments or questions? Yes, Sammy.
What has to be integrated? Is it the deep structure and ego side?
You see, ego psychologies and self-psychology of various types focus on the importance of integration, regulation, the capacity to be able to become aware and conscious of the variety of things which buffet us about in our psychological and relational lives. Now that is important. That is key. I consider myself a self-psychologist, a neo-Jungian self-psychologist. But, think about this in the context of other sciences. Can you imagine doing brain surgery without having some sense of the way in which brain structures relate to each other and relate to functioning, and a sense of what healthy structural functioning in the brain is compared to unhealthy or pathological functioning? Or can you imagine what it would be like to try to do chemistry without having some sense of what different elements are that are present in reactions, chemical reactions? Or in geology. We have a geologist here. Can you imagine trying to be a geologist without knowing the distinctive properties of different geological forms, different minerals, and so on? In psychology, particularly in dynamic psychology, we're real impressed with ourselves in this field, but we don't really, do very much to work scientifically at understanding what the things are that the ego has to integrate. The early Freudians, really did a lot with conflict theory, which I think was thrown out prematurely. I think that they were looking at something real there, but they wanted to stay away from other sciences. So when you ask that question, it's like the issue is, well, what are the elements for forming selfhood, for forming a healthy ego, that are not random and that are not simply personal to you? In other words, if you think that you're so screwed up simply out of your own creativity, that's kind of grandiose. I find a lot of folks that really think that they are responsible for how hard it is to live. fact, that's one of the things I work on a lot in my analytical work with people, trying to get them to realize, no. You're not struggling because you're so defective. You're struggling because this is extremely hard to do what we're trying to do. You are trying to balance things which are incredibly difficult to balance for anybody, no matter how good their childhood was. And I say to people, well, if it was really as easy to balance all these forces that we humans have to try to balance, this world would not be in such a mess everywhere you look. So it's a matter of trying to get a sense of what are these forces really, and what do we know about them scientifically, not just from dream interpretation. I want us to realize that dream interpretation, for example, I'm not giving a paper at this dream conference, but if I had been giving a paper, I would be talking about deep structures in dream interpretation, because that is not talked about much. I would have been talking about how do you know in a dream, how do you know when that dream is telling you how the war of functions is going on in your psyche? How do you know when you are, for example, being overrun by aggression? Because if you come to dream interpretation and you don't have a theory that tells you what the elements are that are trying to be balanced, and you just look at the dream, it's always good to look at dreams. But what I am suggesting is that if you're going to get more scientific about dream interpretation, you need to be able to connect the imagination to the plumbing. And this is my criticism of those that follow Hillman and all the so-called archetypal psychologists. They have got people believing that it's intellectually legitimate to have a theory of the imagination that does not connect it to any plumbing. And quite frankly, that is intellectually bogus. And it's really kind of intellectual trickery, because if you're going to have a theory of the imagination, it has to be connected to the human animal and its functioning biologically, psychologically, so on. So another time I'll give that.
You shouldn't necessarily integrate everything that comes into your dreams. There are some things in your dreams that you should just sort of push out of consciousness.
Well, she's asking, let me repeat this for the tape, she's asking, does this mean that if there's an archetypal image that comes up in a dream that you need to be aware that maybe everything shouldn't be integrated like a Gestalt therapist might think? I believe that. I believe that what you say is true in general. But it goes a little further than that in terms of dream interpretation. That is to say, it's very important for you, in my view, for you to get a sense for what is represented by that archetypal image. What issue is represented by that archetypal image? What dynamic issue related to the integration of yourself is represented by that archetypal image? And so all I'm saying is that actually, if you have got a dream series that you've been working on, it is possible for you to reflect on the dream series and look at what archetypal themes and archetypal images come up, and to get a much clearer sense about what is structurally wrong in your ego and in your self-function. That is, it should be related to your treatment plan. That is to say, if a dream is diagnostic, in my view, it also has to be structurally diagnostic. That is to say, it should give you insight into where your psyche fails, where it breaks, where it splits. Each one of us in this room, there's not a single person in this room that does not split and fragment. All of us do. The interesting thing is that we have different fault lines in our psyche. Some of us have more trouble with this archetypal energy than with others. And so that's simply what I'm trying to get at in terms of dream interpretation. That dream interpretation needs to be related to some theory of the plumbing of the psyche which is capable of being understood and tested as a theory. And this is not widely accepted. And so we get into some romanticism of dreams, that dreams somehow interpret themselves without a theory. Well, they certainly present issues, but I hope that we can get to the point where we're where we're more able to relate our ongoing dream life to our ongoing integration issues, in a clear way. Other questions or comments before we take a break? Yes, go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that one part of society that is maybe not even aware that they're doing it, but Madison Avenue and movie makers are dealing with deep structures. Maybe not always, it's not a conscious strategy, but I think they do deal with those topics.
Yeah, Steve's comment is that Madison Avenue and Hollywood are doing a lot of things with deep structures. And then he raised the question of whether or not they're probably conscious of this. I think they are conscious of it. Madison Avenue and Hollywood have a lot of money, and they can hire very outstanding scholars in these fields. And if you think that DreamWorks has not got a bunch of scholars on the payroll helping them understand archetypes and mythic structures so that they can be used in filmmaking, you got another thing coming. So I think you're right. And increasingly, media people are incredibly sophisticated in utilizing these images in manipulating publics. This is one of the things politically and ethically we have to be so concerned about. What happens when the media and the elites have more sophisticated understanding of archetypes and archetypal structures than the public? You get yourself into a situation then in which the concept of political democracy begins to be very iffy. Look at Noam Chomsky's film, The Manufacture of Consent, which is about the media and this kind of issue. So that's a very sophisticated question, and it's relevant for what we're talking about today. Tomorrow, I'll comment further on that about what happens when folks do not take the responsibility for leading toward the integration of the functions socially and politically. Right now, for example, what's happening in our country is that we have a prison industry. Remind me to announce about this prison conference at the Chicago Theological Seminary and the Institute for World Spirituality. But there are a lot of people making money off of our failures to help young people integrate their functions. And if there's more money in building prisons than there is in helping tutor young people and help to mentor them so they can integrate their functions that we're talking about, then there are going to be more prisons and not put any money into mentoring programs. So that's a little example of what's going on now. So it is politically relevant. Any other comment before we take a break? So here's the deal. If you're going, in my view, if you're going to carry this scientific psychoanalysis, and I mean that up front, different sciences use different research techniques and different methods, but a science that is worthy of being called a science does develop theory. And it develops a theory that can be tested against evidence. And in psychoanalysis today, and I don't mean just Jungian psychoanalysis, I mean in terms of a number of the other traditions, they are increasing the distance. For example, even in psychoanalytic self-psychology out of Kohut's tradition, they are de-emphasizing the importance of relating their findings to other scientific findings. Yeah, even in the Kohut school, which I deeply appreciate as a contribution to understanding empathy and the struggle of the self for integration, they are making what I believe to be a tremendously misguided move toward trying to say they are not doing science and therefore they don't need to be, they do not need to be relating this to other scientific psychological evidence. They say that's not really psychoanalysis if you're dealing with empirical evidence. It's only introspection that's psychoanalysis. And I think that is a cul-de-sac that will destroy psychoanalysis as a science if we follow that route. So the challenge is to use our special research. You know, we've got to work on an inner Hubble telescope, and that's really what I think. The mapping of inner space. We've got to turn up the Hubble inside to map this inner space, and dream work and a lot of other inner work is a research tool. But it cannot be made it cannot be disconnected from other sources of information, or you destroy you turn Jungian psychology into a cult, as Noel said. When you do that, if you cut it off from, or you turn co-ed psychology into a cult. Jung wasn't the first psychoanalytic cult. Freud's was the first psychoanalytic cult. And these tendencies to turn inward and not relate to other sources of data is a typical cultic phenomenon, and we don't want to go that way. So anyway, let's take our break now, come back in about 10 minutes, and we'll survey some of these other uses of myth. And then this afternoon we'll turn to what I believe is possibilities of our using some of these sources in a much more detailed, effective manner. So let's take about 10 minutes. Let me just survey these previous approaches, Jungian approaches to myth and psyche. We start with Jung, and it's very important to in the light of what we talked about earlier, to get a sense about why Jung thought it important to look at mythic images, because he was not an antiquarian, and it's very when you get into the studies of comparative mythology and the different theories that are present in the academy today and so forth, you got to really tune up your sensitivity to theoretical assumptions that they bring to the myths, because that tends to be the tail that wags the dog. For example, Wendy Doniger, when she translated this big dictionary of mythology from the French, since she did not want to emphasize common patterns in mythology across cultures, since she did not want to emphasize that, she totally changed the organization of this French scholar's book when she translated it. And she organized it totally differently to de-emphasize the common mythic patterns cross-culturally, because in the universities today it's not politically correct to emphasize common patterns cross-culturally. The emphasis today is the difference in standpoints, not the things that are held in common. And so with Jung, I mean, the reason you look at mythology or folklore or religious traditions or anything that are products, anything that's a product of the mythic imagination, Jung is a scientist when he does this. He's looking at this and he's asking himself this question. He says, okay, a mythic image is the face an instinct turns to the world. And so when Jung is coming to a mythic image, of course he was a scholarly person and an intellectual, and he was very interested in all sorts of things. But when he was doing his work as a psychoanalytic scientist, he wasn't just interested in these nice little folk tales and so on, just in themselves. He was asking what kind of instinctual pattern this image is connected to. So in other words, you look at the mythic image and you ask yourself, now, how does this reflect the plumbing of the psyche? And how does this image relate to that image? And how does the study of this image illuminate what is in the collective unconscious? And so when Jung would study alchemy, he wasn't simply a museum curator interested in all those fascinating alchemical texts. Certainly he liked to collect them. But he was looking at those alchemical images and those alchemical pictures for clues, as Edward Edinger, another man I admire a lot for his serious studies of the objective psyche, clues into the anatomy of the psyche. That's the key phrase. When Jung was looking at a mythic image, he wanted to know, what does this tell us about the anatomy of the psyche? So for Jung, a medical person who was very familiar with human physical anatomy, he felt that there was a psychological anatomy, and that psychological anatomy was reflected in mythic images. So you can see, now look, and we'll get to this afternoon in spades, Because if you come to Dumézil's work today, the research that he and his followers have done around the world, and you come with, say, Wendy Doniger's point of view, or with a lot of the other scholars who don't think there's anything in the psyche that's a deep structure, the deep structural patterns. And your axe you want to grind is you want to prove how unique this society is compared to any other. That when they say this about this God, it has nothing to do with what anybody says about any other God. This is culturally unique, situationally, contextually unique. If you bring that axe to grind to a mythic image, then it's going to have an impact on what you learn. I think you can see. However, if you are Jung, and if Jung had access to this vast body of comparative literature, he would not be asking, antiquarian things. He would be saying, now, what do the patterns that we see here tell us about the instinctual patterns in the unconscious? So that's the fundamental lead. Now, Jung himself was very interested, as you know, in Christianity. He was interested in the Bible. He was interested in Oriental religions. He was interested in Native American religions. And so by virtue of that, he was very interested in mythic structures from all those different traditions, and he studied them as best he could given the scholarship of his day. But we need to be aware that if you study Swiss Christianity, even in Jung's day, it's a long way from the foundations of the Western mythical traditions to Swiss Christianity in 1900. That is to say, the kind of research that we'll look at this afternoon is uncanny in the specificity of what different gods represent, and across a number of different traditions. But anyway, okay, so of course everyone is familiar with the way in which Joseph Campbell sought to relate the studies of Jungian psychology to mythic tradition. And I have a number of times before referred to this tradition in mythological studies, which goes from the German anthropologist Adolf Bastian, Bastien, and which can be traced to Jung, and then Joseph Campbell, and I also believe Eliade. And the assumption, different from most scholars today, most so-called post-structuralist or postmodernist scholars today, in a way that's radically opposed to the current intellectual fads. All of these people in this tradition assume that there is a human psyche, and it gives rise to a mythic imagination, and that there are recurrent patterns in that mythic imagination that are not peripheral to human being, but that are constitutive of human being. That is to say, for Campbell, now let's look at Campbell. You say Joseph Campbell, although his work ranged extremely widely, if you haven't seen his 4-volume Masks of the Gods, you should look at that. But you think hero, the mythology of the hero. And the book Hero with 1,000 Faces is a magnificent piece of work. And it focuses, on this fundamental journey, or what I call pilgrimage mythology in human tradition. And in that book, Campbell draws upon a wide range of mythical traditions, in effect, from a Jungian point of view, showing how mythology reflects the struggle for individuation, the struggle to emerge from unconsciousness, to gain awareness and illumination, and then to have the courage to return to the world with your illumination. I mean, that hero cycle, that's wonderful charts in there. I've reproduced some of them in some of my books. But in any case, so what do you see there? Well, Campbell is standing in Jung's tradition, much wider knowledge of comparative mythology than Jung had. And he is pressing the same case, though. He's saying, look, the things that make you human are reflected in human mythology, and the struggle which you as an individual go through is reflected right there in mythological traditions if you have eyes to see. And this is really about your struggle to emerge from unconsciousness and to gain insight, and then to not just isolate, which is the temptation for intellectuals and scholars. That is, if you really get good at analysis, intellectual analysis, you begin to see how bad things are. You begin to see how complicated they are. And it's very easy just to say, oh, this is too much trouble. I'm just going to go write another book. I'm just going to go write another article about a more and more narrow topic, less and less likely to get me attacked. So Campbell stands very squarely in some of these fundamental assumptions. He does not elaborate. He doesn't have the sense, the deep sense of the plumbing that Jung did, of course, because he was not a psychoanalyst. And scholars have been right to point out that Campbell had his own particular assumptions about mythology. And, for example, the way in which he privileges Eastern mythologies over Western mythologies. For example, you don't find a lot in Campbell of in-depth studies of the kind of material that we'll talk about this afternoon. He did not, he really did not like these traditions that had too many war chariots, So, as I like to say, Campbell's a lover-magician type guy, and that's the kind of mythology he liked, lover-magician mythology. But, Campbell was Jungian enough in his assumptions to get himself viciously attacked in the academic world. And it has not been so long since Wendy Doniker, in very, very widespread public pronouncements, declared Campbell really insignificant and really sort of an embarrassment to mythological studies and so on. In my view, largely because of her preconceptions about the nature of the psyche. There is no collective unconscious, so to speak. And that Campbell was reading in similarities and parallels in mythology that really were not there, and making too much light of historical individual differences. So in any case, Campbell now has been pilloried in the academic world, and nobody, no graduate student in their right mind today in mainline universities would dare suggest doing any kind of advanced work on Campbell unless it was to destroy him intellectually. It's the same thing the same attitude that exists toward Jung and toward Eliade now. Even Eliade now has come under the scathing, dismissive kinds of attacks. And I recently sat in a meeting at the American Academy of Religion in which all the bright young fellows were competing with how much they could insult Eliade. It's Eliade's turn, but it is, I think, particularly Campbell's agreement with Jung on the importance of comparative studies of mythology for understanding the dynamics of the human, the common human, meaning that which we share in common, that has been largely responsible for how little he's respected now in the academic world. Eliade was a harder target. In the early days, Eliade was acquaintance of Jung and was present at some of the Eros conferences, which were some of those leading Jungian consultations about the relevance of mythology and spirituality for understanding the human life. And before he came to America, Eliade did not know how dangerous it would be to be affiliated with Jung. And so he used the word archetype in his work. When he got to the University of Chicago and discovered how out of favor Jung was in the United States, and especially at the University of Chicago, he quickly said, "Oh, I'm not using this like Jung." And then when he published his book, Patterns in Comparative Religion, he said, "No, what I'm talking about are structures in comparative religion, patterns in comparative religion, structures in comparative religion, not archetypes like Jung uses them." And that did buy him some time. He was able to maintain a positive reputation in scholarship, and studying comparatively all these different mythical traditions. And I invite you to take a look at the sweep of Eliade's enormous corpus of work, which I like to say to Jungians, analysts in training and so on, study Eliade, if you're going to try to get a sense of comparative patterns in the archetypal realm. Don't waste your time with a lot of recent Jungian stuff. Study Eliade. Eliade, and there are a number of my lecture series that are available that I've given here on the relationship of Eliade's work to psychology of the self, and the way in which the mythology that Eliade has discussed illuminates a lot of the processes of self-formation. The lectures I gave on creation mythology and the self, and the series on myth and psyche and so on. If you follow Eliade's view, it's a different slant than Campbell. Eliade is much more interested in showing the way in which myth is about the process through which humans relate to the numinous. Another chief preoccupation of Jung. Jung believed that healing comes through relating to the numinous, to that which is primordially powerful and beyond the control of ego. That all true healing really comes from an encounter with the numinous. And as you know, Jung believed that the presence of the numinous was not just in the Bible or in the church or in the relics or in the saints of whatever tradition, but that the presence of the sacred, of the numinous, was in the depths of the psyche. And so Eliade, without emphasizing anything about the plumbing, he totally tried to avoid that. He did, however, see himself as discussing the patterns in what he called the transconscious, and showing the way in which humans have related to the transformative and redemptive energies of the numinous throughout history in all the different tribes. And the whole discussion that he has about the journey to the center. In fact, if I were to talk about Eliade, the key to Eliade's work, it would be I have a very, very unfinished manuscript called Journey to the Center, in which I talk about Eliade and Tillich and so on, thinking about the pilgrimage to the center to get contact with transformative energies. Well, it's quite, if you study Eliade and you look at the struggle of the psyche to connect with life-giving energies, if you think about your struggle to connect with life-giving energies, particularly as some of you know, some of you who are getting older, like me, after you get 40, you begin to understand that Eliade stuff better, because you begin to be more aware of the mortality, and as Paul Tillich to stay with Sammy here on her Tillich studies, talks about the struggle of being against non-being. And so to put it up front, it's like Eliade felt that mythology was not peripheral to human life, or that mythology was simply very fragmentary and atomic with regard to human beings. He believed that at the heart of all mythology was a commentary, a very, very subtle, very, very diverse commentary about the human struggle to journey to the center with a capital C, to find energy for living, and to try to use that energy to counteract the tendencies toward despair about the terror of history. Now, anybody who just talks about Jungian psychology or Jungian psychoanalysis may not get it about how psychological that is. But if you sit, as I do, with people every day who are struggling to maintain the forces of life against the forces of death in their lives, then the relevance of Eliade's interpretation of mythology for human life and human psychology is painfully obvious. And that's what I have lectured on here before. So in other words, like Campbell, Eliade felt that mythology was not just some little add-on, some little political, sociological derivative for human beings and human psyche. that mythology showed the depths of the struggle for life against death and life against despair, and showed the way in which ritual processes, such as initiation processes and coronation processes and alchemical processes, and even metallurgy, for our geologists here. Metallurgy shows how the foundations of metallurgy, the study of metals for human beings, have been not merely technical, like they tend to be today among so many scientists, but how they were seen as spiritual sciences, and how when you were working with gold, or you're working with bronze, or you're working with silver, that you could see how much this reflected your struggle as a human being for transformation, illumination, transfiguration, and so on. So anyway, I mean, I go on forever on that. It's such wonderful, rich material, and it's very difficult for me to contain my, as we'll say this afternoon, my second function, which is aggression. It's very difficult for me to contain my aggression when I sit and hear a bunch of wet behind the ears, two-bit scholars dismiss this giant with such cavalier arrogance. So enough of that. Jean Bolin. Jean Bolin, I'm indebted to for her early studies, the Goddesses in Every Woman and the Gods in Every Man books. Books which, though they're popular books, I think they're important books. And if Jean never did anything else other than publish those two books, she would have made a significant contribution to us. And I say that because what she did in those books was to try to take studies of mythology, mythical tradition, in her case almost exclusively Greek, and try to get more specific about the usefulness of mythological traditions, and I'll put it in my language, in differential diagnosis. That is, to pay attention to particular mythological forms in relationship to deities, and to ask the question, what psychological energy specifically is imaged by this goddess or by this god? And how does this relate to my struggle as a woman or my struggle as a man? For example, if I study Aphrodite, can I come to understand some of my struggles as a woman or as a man with his anima, certain aspects of his anima, about a certain way of being in the world which elevates erotic preoccupations to the center of life? I know you all know there are some individuals in our culture who have a problem with their erotic life in keeping it in perspective. I won't name any names, but Bill Clinton comes to mind. Jean Bolin enabled us to reflect upon the way in which Aphrodite functions in the anima of Bill Clinton. And as we'll see this afternoon, this is not something that Jean thought of first. I mean, this is not something she has created. As we'll see this afternoon, people for a long time have reflected on what happens if Aphrodite gets inordinate power in a social situation. We'll come back to that in terms of some of Scott Littleton's research on that. But in any case, Jean really took us to a new level in the clinical usefulness of reflection on specific gods or goddesses in specific traditions. Now, her work was not comprehensive. She did not do what we're going to look at this afternoon. She did not ask how Aphrodite is related to other gods in other traditions. But she did take us to a new level in clinical usefulness of mythological reflection in terms of specificity, in terms of diagnosing particular strengths and particular weaknesses. For example, her studies of the goddess Hestia, a goddess characterized by a lot of introversion, a lot of calm centeredness around the hearth in a home. Through her studies of Hestia, she has enabled us, I believe, if we would listen to her better, to depathologize a lot of behaviors that are present in a lot of women. That is to say, you can say, well, so-and-so is a dependent personality disorder. Passive dependent. And you can be focusing on all the stuff that this person cannot do, which is typical of us clinicians. We tend to like that if it moves, we pathologize it, right? But if you look at Jean Boland's work, she looks at this goddess Hestia, and she asks the question, what is this? What is this energy? What is this potential? What is this capacity represented? Psychic capacity represented by this goddess. And she lifts up that wonderful calmness, that wonderful ease at being alone, being there in her own presence. That is such an incredibly non-busy, non-type A, such a serenity that so few of us, males or females, today can't attain. So Jean Boland's work, for example, her work on males, I found it extremely helpful to me in my research to reflect on her reflections about the god Ares as it manifests in males. Because in the course of my practice, I had before reading her work, I had met a lot of Aries males, but I did not have the contribution that she had made to helping me realize, see this as a configuration grounded in archetypal energies. And an Aries male is one that full of passionate, hot red energy, can't decide whether to have sex with you or to fight you or in what order. Passionate man in a hurry, not discouraged about many things, impatient with intellectuals, impatient with reflection. If I have an Aries male in my practice, it would be a miracle if I could get him to read a book, right? The whole idea of buying a book or having a bookcase for an Aries male is sort of an insult to him. It says, what is this? Ooh. So Boland took this whole enterprise of reflecting on mythic images to another place, a lot clearer than a lot of other people's work, and in some ways it's very unfortunate that has not been continued in a more systematic way and has not been broadened as much as it needs to be to the study of other traditions in a similar way. So these folks have all emphasized the importance of mythology and mythological images in understanding psychodynamics. What did they not do so well? Even Jung. In my view, while Jung pressed for the understanding of deep structures and patterns, for example, when Tony Wolff wanted to highlight the role of different structural forms in the psyche as opposed to typology as a key issue, they had a sort of a dividing of the ways. I think that that Tony Wolff was doing work that led in the direction of where I think we need to go today. In fact, I claim her as a mother in the tradition for me. Her work on the structural forms of the feminine directly parallels the things that I later developed. So Jung did not put a lot of emphasis on getting very clear about the specific structural forms and how they relate to each other structurally, geometrically. It's not that he did not intuit this, because if you look at the diagrams of the structure of the archetypal self in Ion, he had an intuition, and for our geologist, he had an intuition that the archetypal self was an octahedron. He intuited that, and he saw diagrams of this from a variety of traditions. And other folks have tried to work on that geometric dimension. And for a lot of folks who want to mystify the psyche rather than understand it, the idea that the archetypal self is an octahedron to them feels simplistic and Philistine. It's somehow too, as one person once said about me, more knows too much about the self. Which is really fascinating to me if we're doing science. It would be like saying such and such Shoemaker Levy knew too much about comets. That's an odd thing to say if you're doing science. If you're doing religion or a cult, to say somebody knows too much about the mysteries makes sense, because your authority depends on mystification, not clarification. So Jung had a sense about even the geometric dimensions of psyche. He had studied Pythagoras, and a lot of these ancient thinkers in the mythology of the psyche from Pythagoras on had a sense about the structural, the geometric, the relationship between mathematics and psyche. And Jung intuited that, but he did not pursue it. And when Tony Wolff tried, he got very disturbed. Campbell, again, Campbell has got an axe to grind with regard to pilgrimage, journey. And he lifts up that archetype I call the archetype of pilgrimage, or the archetype of initiation. When I discuss what Campbell emphasizes in my work, I call it the archetype of initiation. That's what Campbell is interested in. He is right about that. The archetype of initiation is a key fundamental structure in our psyche. And the only thing that I would say is that is a structure. It is there cross-culturally. He's right about that, but it's like he needs to find other chords to play on the guitar. It's like the archetype of initiation is not the only archetype in the psyche. Eliade, here again the same issue. Eliade was interested in the archetype of initiation and transformation. And more than Campbell, he put emphasis on the numinous. Campbell didn't put so much emphasis on the numinous. That primordial other that manifests to you on the mountaintop or in the burning bush. Campbell was more in that tradition with Rumi and others who have this sort of erotic mysticism in which I and God are really one. And so these union mysticisms of erotic union, in which you don't really emphasize the manifestation of the divine here that I come to. When you're in an erotic union mysticism, I am the divine. And it's my bliss that's the bliss of all the dancing gods and goddesses in the world. And come join me, I am Shiva in the dance. And if you don't get it, come spend some time with me. That's that erotic mysticism. And that's a particular location in the psyche and in myth. And it is an important one, but it's not the whole thing. So Eliade really put emphasis on the journey to the center out there, and the manifestation of the numinous, and the place where you can hook up for the transformative energy. So they were working the same territory. They were just putting emphasis on a different aspect. Eliade was more aware of the navel of the world, the archetype of the navel of the world, the archetype of the center. We haven't done enough writing yet about the archetype of the center in psychology. That's what I was trying to do in those lectures on creation mythology and the self, the formation of the self.